Her hands do not shake, and that is the first thing you notice about her. She is kneeling in a field of ash and scorched earth where a church used to stand, sliding two pieces of salvaged timber together with nothing but a chisel, a mallet, and a grip that says she has done this 10,000 times before. The whole town is watching her work, but nobody is saying a single word. There are no nails and no iron available, and with no supplies coming for 6 weeks, a woman nobody in Dust Creek ever thought twice about is the only person with a plan. She had carried those tools for 20 years and never wanted to use them in this place, but the fire changed everything. She came in on a supply wagon in the spring of 1882, sitting up front next to a crate of dry goods and a roll of canvas tarp. The driver let her off at the edge of town without any ceremony, and she climbed down with one trunk that was bound in cedar and wrapped tight in oilcloth. The rope was tied in a way that suggested the knots had been fastened and loosened many times before. Harlan Briggs ran the dry goods store on the main street and had written ahead for a seamstress, which is how he ended up with Shion. He did not ask many questions because the stitchwork samples she sent were better than anything he had seen in the county. A man running a store on the frontier learns quickly that skill matters more than background when there is work to be done. The first reaction from the town was not hostility, but it was something closer to confusion, which is almost worse because confusion does not know what to do with itself. Men tipped their hats and then looked at each other with puzzled expressions. Women watched her from doorways and talked about her over fences in the way people do when they are not sure if they are being rude. A few of them assumed she was Chinese, but she did not correct them because it was not a conversation she wanted to have. She found a room above the livery stable and paid Hector Reyes 3 months in advance without being asked, then set the trunk under the bed before she had even unpacked her clothes. Hector was a quiet man who only asked her one question in those first weeks, which was whether the smell of the horses bothered her. She told him no, so he simply nodded and left her alone, and that was the best arrangement she could have hoped for. Briggs vouched for her stitch work to anyone who asked, and people certainly did ask, because in a small town, a new face is a question that does not go away until somebody answers it. His word was enough to get her customers, though it did not get her friends. In Dust Creek in 1882, that was the only currency that counted for anything if you did not already have family there. In her first week, she walked the perimeter of the church 3 different times at different hours, running her fingers along the timber joints where the corner posts met the crossbeams. The joinery was rough and functional, the kind of thing a man builds when he knows it needs to stand, but does not think too hard about how. She pressed her thumb into one of the gaps where the wood had pulled apart and felt the give. Nobody noticed her doing this because nobody was paying that kind of attention. She settled into her room and her work, and Dust Creek mostly forgot she was there, which is exactly how she wanted it. The church was everything to the people of Dust Creek. That isn't just a figure of speech because the building had to be the schoolhouse all week long and then turn into a courthouse whenever the circuit judge rolled into town. It was the only roof large enough to hold a town meeting without half the crowd standing out in the dirt, and if you took it away, the town would just be a few lonely storefronts with nothing to hold them together. Pastor Elias Cobb understood that better than anyone, which is why he looked after the place with the kind of quiet care most men only show to their own children. Cobb handled the Sunday service and the Wednesday school lessons with equal focus, and he could switch from a sermon to an arithmetic problem as easily as a man changes his hat. He was a thin, soft-spoken man who possessed the specific kind of patience you only get from years of talking to people who aren't really listening to a word you say. He also happened to be the only person in the entire territory who bothered to nod at Shion when they passed on the street. It wasn't a long gesture or an invitation to talk, but it was an acknowledgement that she was a human being, and in a town that usually looked right through her, that small nod meant everything. The man who actually held the keys to the town wasn't the pastor, though. That power belonged to Dolph Greer, a man who ran cattle on 400 acres north of the creek and had a face that looked like it had never been told no in 50 years. Greer was the one who controlled the big contracts and settled the local disputes, and he decided behind closed doors who got a fair shake and who didn't. He wasn't a villain in the way you see in stories, but he was something much more common, a man who had built his own kingdom and saw no reason to share it with anyone who hadn't earned a spot on his specific terms. Shion watched the gears of the town turn from the very edge of the circle. She spent her days sewing, and she got paid her fair wage. And because she never complained or pushed for more, the town rewarded her by leaving her alone. That suited her just fine most days of the week. Behind the livery, tucked into a narrow strip of dirt between the wood siding and the fence, she kept a small garden of medicinal herbs. These were plants she had grown up working with back home, and most of them didn't have English names she even knew how to say out loud. Doc Fenner was old enough to have seen everything, and cynical enough to doubt anything he hadn't touched himself, and he once stopped to inspect her little corner of green. When he asked what the low, gray-leafed plant in the corner was, she told him the truth, but he just squinted at it for a long minute before saying, and walking away. She never did find out if he believed her or if he just thought she was growing weeds. The cedar trunk stayed locked under her bed. Every Sunday morning, before the church bell started its ringing, and before Hector began moving the horses downstairs, she would pull it out just to oil the heavy hinges. She never actually opened it, but she would run her thumb along the rough grain of the wood and slide it back into the dark. It was a habit that didn't have a logical explanation, but she had started doing it on the long ship ride across the ocean, and she hadn't found a reason to stop yet. For 2 long years, this was the rhythm of her life. Then the fire came and changed everything. It all started with a single lantern. Nobody actually knows who left the wick burning that night. That was a question the town would chew on for years afterward, the way small communities obsess over things they can never really prove. It was a bone-dry night in August when the air felt like it had been wrung out like a wet rag, and the wood in every building had been baking in that relentless heat for weeks on end. Sometime after the clock struck midnight, the church caught a spark. The whole place went up fast. That was the one detail people kept repeating when they talked about it later. It took maybe an hour, or perhaps even less, for the pine resin in those old timbers to start burning with a sweet, heavy scent. It was a smell that had no business being pleasant, but it was anyway, hanging thick underneath the sounds of panic and the rolling black smoke. The bell tower was the last part to go, and you could hear the exact second the base gave out because it sounded like a rifle shot echoing through the valley. There was a low groan that seemed to happen in slow motion, and then the whole structure came down and sent sparks flying into the dark sky. Every able-bodied man in town formed a bucket line, starting at the horse trough on the main street. They threw water until their arms went numb, and their eyes were streaming from the sting of the smoke, but none of it mattered in the end. The building was a total loss before the sky even started to turn gray with the coming dawn. By the time the sun was up, there was nothing left but the heavy foundation stones and a rectangle of gray ash with charred timber ends sticking out of the dirt like broken teeth. The list of what they lost was devastating. Every school record from the last 4 years was gone, along with Pastor Cobb's library, which was the only collection of books for 40 miles in any direction. The deed registry the town had kept since the day it was founded burned up too, which was going to cause legal nightmares that nobody was ready to face yet. Even the piano was gone, a battered old upright that had been hauled in on a freight wagon from the east, and it was the only instrument Cobb had to teach the children on during their Wednesday lessons. Shion watched the entire disaster from the safety of the livery roof. She had woken up the second that sweet smell of burning resin hit her nose, and she went straight for her trunk before she even looked out the window. By the time she climbed up to the shingles to see the fire, it was already far too late for anyone to save the building. She sat there with the trunk tucked against her side and watched the bucket line work until they failed, and she didn't go down to help because there was nothing she could do that 40 men with buckets weren't already trying to handle. The next morning, Greer sent a rider out to the lumber yard in Caldwell to get supplies. 4 days later, that rider came back with the worst news possible. The Caldwell yard had burned down 2 weeks earlier in a separate fire, which was just bad luck piled on top of more bad luck, and there wouldn't be any supply wagons heading their way for at least 6 weeks. The rider looked like he had been dreading the trip back the entire way home. A heavy silence settled over the town after that news broke. It wasn't the normal quiet of a sleepy afternoon, but something much heavier that happens when people realize a problem has no easy fix. 6 weeks was simply too long to wait. Everyone knew that winter always came early to Dust Creek, and without that central building, the children had no school and the sick had no place to stay warm. The town didn't even have a room big enough to hold a meeting to figure out what they were going to do next. The ash was still warm to the touch when the arguing finally started. Greer didn't waste a single hour on grief because that simply wasn't how he operated. 2 days after the fire turned the church to ash, he had every able-bodied man in Dust Creek organized into work crews to pull salvageable timber from the blackened wreckage. Some of the beams were scorched on the outside, but the wood underneath remained solid enough to be worth using for a new frame. He put Virgil Hooks in charge of the project, since Virgil had been the town carpenter for 11 years and understood wood with the kind of instinct men develop after a lifetime of hard labor. He could eyeball a heavy beam and tell you its length within an inch, making him the only logical choice for the job. The problem was that the job refused to stay finished. The first frame went up on the second day of work, but the men had to pull it back down by the third morning. They didn't have enough iron spikes to secure the corner posts properly, so when Virgil tried to space out the few nails they had, the entire structure shifted during the night and caused one corner to drop. Nobody was injured when it happened, but the frame sat there at a pathetic tilt in the morning light like it was embarrassed to be seen. The men dismantled it in total silence and prepared to start over from scratch. Their second attempt relied on a different style of joinery that used longer, overlapping timbers, notched and stacked together. It was the kind of rough work you'd do if you were in a desperate hurry and had plenty of wood to spare. The structure held for 2 days, but then the green timber began to move as the moisture worked its way out of the grain. Unseasoned wood twists and bows without asking for permission, and by the 6th day, the second frame had warped so badly that Pastor Cobb walked through the entrance and felt the main post rock under his hand. He didn't say a word to the crew, he just turned around and walked back out. The third attempt was the one that finally broke Virgil's spirit. He used whatever materials were left to build a simple rectangular frame with 4 walls and a pitched roofline. While the building was structurally sound enough to stand, it was also unmistakably a barn rather than a house of God. Cobb stood in the dirt and looked at the structure for a long time before he quietly told the men he appreciated the effort, but he wouldn't be holding his services inside a stable. 8 days had passed, and 3 attempts had failed. Yet the world wasn't going to wait around for them to figure it out. A child in the Mercer family came down with a dangerous fever that required constant attention in a warm room away from the biting cold of the autumn nights. Doc Finner desperately needed the schoolhouse to serve as a temporary sick room, but since that building was gone, the Mercer boy was laid out on a cot in the back of the dry goods store. He slept between bolts of heavy fabric while his mother sat beside him and tried to keep her eyes off the cramped walls. Greer was absolutely furious in the way powerful men get when they realize they can't fix a problem, and he spent his days shouting in small rooms and making fast decisions that he'd second-guess an hour later. Winter was roughly 6 weeks away from hitting Dust Creek with its first real freeze. In this part of the country, that meant a cold so deep it could turn soft mud into solid iron overnight without any warning. 6 weeks might sound like a long time to a stranger, but it feels like nothing when you calculate how much work still needs to happen before the snow flies. On the evening Virgil's third frame was officially abandoned, Shion walked the construction site alone as the sun went down. She moved with a slow, deliberate pace while stepping over the scattered ends of timber, stopping at certain points to hold her hands out to orient herself in the fading light. She pulled a knotted cord from her apron pocket and ran it between her fingers along the foundation line to check the measurements. She didn't write a single thing down, and she didn't say a word to anyone else that night. Early the next morning, before Hector had even started feeding the horses, She reached under her bed and pulled out her heavy cedar trunk. Greer kept his office in the back of the land registry building, a cramped space that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, where a massive desk took up most of the floor. He was hunched over a ledger when Shion walked in, and he didn't even bother to put his pen down as she approached. He told her the office was closed for the morning, but she ignored him and set the heavy trunk directly on his desk. That finally got his attention because he realized exactly how much strength it took to lift a cedar-bound chest full of iron tools. She had carried that weight up the front steps in both arms without stopping once to catch her breath. He ordered her to take the box off his desk, but she opened the lid instead. Inside the trunk sat a hand plane with a wooden handle worn so smooth it had taken the permanent shape of a human palm. There were chisels tucked into a rolled canvas sleeve and a marking gauge with a brass thumbscrew that had grown dark from years of constant handling. Underneath the tools lay a piece of paper folded as carefully as a precious letter, covered in detailed ink diagrams and columns of neat Japanese notations. Greer stared at the drawings the way a man looks at something he has already decided he doesn't want to understand. He asked her if she was trying to sell the tools to the town. She told him no, explaining instead that she could rebuild the church frame in 8 days without using a single iron nail. She described the joinery her father had taught her back in Osaka, where the wood is cut to lock together under its own weight. These joints don't need metal to stay strong, because the more weight they carry, the tighter the connection becomes. She told him she had already walked the foundation and knew exactly what the salvaged timber was capable of giving her. She spoke plainly and slowly because she knew Greer was going to need a moment to process what he was hearing. Greer let her finish her pitch before he told her that her plan was the most expensive kind of wrong a person could be. He wasn't trying to be mean to her, he was just absolutely certain that a building couldn't stand without iron spikes. There is a specific kind of confidence that comes from a man who has never seen a different way of doing things, and Greer had that confidence in spades. Pastor Cobb had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room the entire time, and you might not have even noticed he was there until he finally spoke up. He had come in early to talk about the deed registry, but he stayed to listen to Shion's proposal. He waited for Greer to finish his dismissal, and then he asked Shion how long she said the frame would take to build. 8 days, she answered. Cobb turned his gaze toward Greer and pointed out that they had already wasted 8 days doing things the traditional way. He reminded Greer that they currently had a barn they couldn't use, a sick boy shivering in the back of a store, and only 6 weeks left before the ground froze solid. He spoke with a quiet tone that made it impossible to argue with him without sounding like you were arguing against basic math. Greer sat back in his chair and chewed on the idea while he ran the numbers in his head. You could see the shift in his eyes as he realized he had completely run out of other options. The deal he finally offered her wasn't what anyone would call generous. She would have access to the salvaged timber and 2 men to help her move the heavy wood, but she was to be left alone while she worked. If that frame wasn't standing in 8 days, he told her she would have to be out of Dust Creek by the following Sunday morning. He said it with a cold bluntness, acting as if he were doing her a favor by being so honest about the stakes. She agreed to his terms without a second of hesitation. She closed the lid of the trunk, hauled it back into her arms, and walked out of the office. Greer watched her leave and then looked over at Cobb, who was already standing up and pulling on his heavy coat. "You actually believe she can do it?" Greer asked. Cobb buttoned his coat slowly and told Greer that he simply believed they had nothing left to lose by finding out. He didn't say it with any judgment in his voice, but they both knew it was the truth, and that was the only reason Shion was getting her chance at all. The work began before the sun had even cleared the horizon on that first morning. Shion had spent the previous night alone, working by the low glow of a lantern to sort the salvaged timber into long, orderly rows east of the foundation. When Virgil Hooks arrived at daybreak, he expected to take charge of the 2 men assigned to the job, but instead, he found Shion already hunched over the longest beam. She was using a charcoal stick to draw lines so thin and deliberate they looked more like the fine print in a scholar's book than marks for a construction site. Virgil stood back with his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with a look that wasn't exactly angry. It was the expression of a man who had already decided this project was going to fail, and he was just waiting for the inevitable collapse so he could finally get on with his day. She didn't look up or acknowledge that he was there. She simply picked up her father's marking gauge, tightened the thumb screw with a quick quarter turn, and pulled it along the length of the beam in one fluid motion. The line it left behind was perfectly straight, and she repeated the process on the face below before picking up a chisel to begin the first cut. The joinery she was creating doesn't have a simple name in English, but the logic behind it is easy to understand once you see it in action. Instead of using iron nails to force two pieces of wood together, you shape the end of one piece so it slides perfectly into the other, like a tongue fitting into a mortise or a tenon locking behind a solid shoulder. When these joints are cut with enough precision, there is no gap or wiggle room at all, and the wood holds itself together through geometry rather than brute force. As the weight of the roof presses down on the structure, these joints actually tighten, meaning the building gets stronger as it gets heavier. This system is called sugite, and it was the same method her father had used for his finest work. The connections where the posts met the beams followed a similar principle called shiguchi, which worked in 3 dimensions to ensure the post head locked into the beam from below. Because of the way these shapes interlock, the frame can't pull free unless the entire beam is lifted straight up, so the building doesn't just settle over time, it locks in. Virgil watched her work for nearly an hour before he finally decided to move closer. He didn't say a word at first, but he spent a long time examining the joint she had just finished, noting the clean walls of the mortise and the perfectly square shoulders. He picked up a scrap piece of wood she'd cut off and turned it over in his hands while he did the math in his head. You could see him trying to figure out the physics of the thing, working out exactly what was holding the weight and how the pieces stayed so tight. Eventually, he asked her a single question about how she kept the shoulder line from drifting during those long grain cuts. Shion showed him her process, explaining how she used the marking gauge for the first pass and then followed it with a paring chisel held bevel down to set the line before making the deep cut. Virgil nodded slowly as he listened, then he reached out and picked up a chisel from her canvas tool roll. He looked at her to see if she minded, and when she didn't stop him, he walked over to the beam beside her and started carving. There were no speeches or formal agreements made between them that morning. He just saw the work that needed to be done and he started doing it. By the 4th day, the first bent was ready to be raised into position. In timber framing, a bent is a complete section of the frame, 2 posts and a crossbeam, that you assemble flat on the ground before lifting it upright to lock into the sill. When the crew finally hauled it up, one of the men carrying the timber let out a sharp grunt of surprise because the wood didn't rattle or shake. It locked together with a heavy, final thud that sounded like a deadbolt sliding into a doorframe. Word started to spread through the town, and soon people began appearing at the edge of the foundation to watch the progress. They stood in small groups of 2 or 3, staying quiet and keeping their distance, but nobody seemed to want to leave once they saw how the pieces fit together. On the 5th day, a massive storm front came screaming in off the plains, bringing the kind of wind that hunts for anything loose and tears it apart. The new frame shuddered under the pressure, but it didn't budge, while Virgil's previous attempt at a barn-shaped structure on the edge of the site was completely leveled within the first hour. The walls of his old build went flat, and the rafters were lifted and scattered across the dirt, leaving almost nothing behind by the time the wind died down. Through all of it, the new frame stayed standing with every joint tight and every post perfectly plumb. Greer showed up on the 6th day and stood there for an hour, watching Shion and Virgil work side by side as they marked and cut the remaining timber. Virgil was fitting the joints like a man who had been practicing this Japanese method for his entire life, and though Greer didn't say anything to either of them, he clearly saw enough. Before noon that day, he sent 2 more men down to the site to help with the heavy lifting. By the 8th day of the build, the entire skeleton of the church was standing tall against the sky. It was square, it was solid, and there wasn't a single iron nail holding the bones of the building together. It took another 2 weeks to finish the walls and the roof, But that part of the job went quickly because the local men finally knew what they were doing. They were comfortable hanging siding and cutting shingles, and because Shion's frame was so precise, they finally had a foundation that didn't shift or lean while they worked. Every time they dropped a plumb line, it came back perfectly true, and every wall they raised sat exactly where it was supposed to against the frame. The building went together the way a structure is actually meant to go, with every piece finding its home without anyone having to use shims or argue about whether a post was straight enough. When the first Sunday service was held in late October, the air was so cold that you could see your breath inside the building for the first 20 minutes. The room only started to warm up once the pews filled with people, and Shion was there, sitting in the very back row right next to the door. She didn't sit there because she wanted to sneak out early, but because that was the only place she felt she belonged. It was her first time stepping inside a church in Dust Creek since she'd arrived 3 years earlier, and while nobody moved to offer her a better seat, nobody asked her to leave either. In that quiet room on that cold morning, the gap between being ignored and being accepted felt smaller than it ever had before. A few days later, Virgil Hooks built a small sign for the front of the building without saying a word to Shion about his plans. He arrived early one morning and mounted a carved wooden panel right above the door frame where she would be sure to see it on her way to the store. When Shion finally walked past and stopped to look, she saw that he had carved the joinery diagram from her father's old papers into the wood. It wasn't a rough sketch or a bad copy, because Virgil had actually taken the time to learn how to read those drawings well enough to get the proportions exactly right. She stood there in the dust for a long time, looking up at the carving, and then she turned and kept walking. It is worth mentioning that Greer never actually apologized for the way he had treated her, because real life rarely offers the kind of tidy endings we see in stories. However, he did stop calling her the China Woman and started using her actual name instead. In a town as hard as Dust Creek, and coming from a man as stubborn as Greer, that change was the loudest public statement he was ever going to make. It wasn't a handshake or a grand gesture, but it was a basic recognition that she was a person, and that her name was Shion. Eventually, the tools were taken out of the trunk and hung up on the wall of the livery, where they would be within easy reach for the next job. The trunk itself went back under her bed in the same spot it had always occupied, but the feeling of the room had changed in that subtle way things shift when you move a single piece of furniture. Everything looked the same on the surface, but nothing felt quite the same as it did before the build. The people of Dust Creek certainly accepted the building that Shion had given them, but whether they truly accepted Shion herself is a much more complicated question. The answer really depends on how you define acceptance. And this story isn't going to lie to you by pretending there was a perfect, happy resolution for everyone involved. In the end, she didn't rebuild that church because she wanted to prove a point to the neighbors who had doubted her. She did it for the simplest reason there is. The town needed a building that would stand, and she was the only person there who knew how to make it happen. Every Sunday morning, she still oiled those hinges, sticking to the same routine she had always known. While she worked, the church bell would ring just one street over, and she would pause with her thumb pressed against the cedar to listen until the sound finally faded away. Shion understood better than anyone in that town that belonging and being welcomed are two very different things. This leaves you with a question worth sitting with. If that trunk was tucked under your bed, would you have found the courage to open it?